Happy Sunday, everybody. It's your old pal Tommy, your comrade in arms. Check out Mr. Businessman. He's got some wild, wild life. Thomas T. Tuttle. What's the T stand for? Trustworthy. Coming at you today on this beautiful Sunday afternoon to talk about Comicsgate and its critics in general, more particularly the 90s, and more particularly a comic that just fell into my lap this week. Comicsgate has a lot of critics. We all know that. And for the most part, they're all this screeching, gelatinous blob that scream things like racist, sexist, homophobe, Nazi, white supremacist, Confederate flag waving Dukes of Hazzards fans. But one criticism that I think has some salience is that to a certain extent we are fans of the 90s who never really escaped our joy and our fascination and our ability to be dazzled by 90s era comics, and we're all trying to take comics back to the 90s, and there's some truth to that for a number of reasons. One is that the 90s were flipping awesome compared to 2023. If you had a time machine and you could go back to the 90s, you'd never return. We'd never see you in present day again. Who would come back from the 90s to present day? The 90s in comics were awesome. Exciting creators were exploding off the page. Liefeld, McFarlane, Image was exploding. For people who wanted to kind of get away from, I should say, traditional superhero comics, things like, or imprints like Vertigo were taking off. The 90s, I can think of 3 decades in the 20th century where there just seemed to be no limits to creativity. If you had an idea and you could get the funding to put it together, there were no 4 corners of the checkerboard to keep you in the board. Everyone was playing off the board. And those 3 decades are the 30s, the 70s, and the 90s. Speaking of the 90s specifically for this video, in film, the indie scene was taking off. Creators like Quentin Tarantino, the Coen brothers, even, God help us, Kevin Smith were emerging for the shill and the hack that he's become today. It will always be worth remembering that his first film, that first Clerks, showed real promise of a real talent. And of course, Tarantino, Reservoir Dogs, and Pulp Fiction changed the way everyone looked at film. And it was happening on TV too. Television was breaking some new barriers. It's no accident that it was the 90s when David Lynch and Mark Frost brought Twin Peaks to ABC television. And as I say, we were seeing that happen in the comics as well. There did not seem to be any limits to what could be told through comics. Vertigo was an exciting imprint. We had creators like Grant Morrison and Neil Gaiman and Alan Moore, Peter Milligan were telling stories that just blew back the back wall of the mind and expanded our consciousness. It was like LSD right there on the page for $2.99 a pop. And the comics that were more traditional, superhero stuff, were getting exciting visually. Again, I'm thinking of Image and Liefeld. I'm thinking of McFarlane, Spider-Man, and Spawn. Um, Things were... There was nothing in the universe that was beyond the scope of man in terms of imagination. And one character that was so lowbrow he almost became highbrow in the 90s. It was just so much fun to pick up and see what havoc he was wreaking was Lobo. Lobo started as a relatively tertiary character in the Omega Men, and then they started using him as guest stars in the Superman and Justice League titles, and eventually Lobo became a recurring character in Legion 94, L period, E period, G period, I period, O period, N period. 93 and 94, 95. Each year had the book had a different title. And then Grant and Bisley and creators like that just went insane with him. And the insanity was infectious. I remember paying good money for The Wisdom of Lobo, which was a square-bound prestige format blank book. Lobo was the book you showed your friends who weren't in the comics because you knew that they would be dazzled by the gore and the no holds barred. Nothing. There were no sacred cows in Lobo. And of course, in 2023, you can't do Lobo. They tried to do a reimagining of Lobo. I don't remember whether this was a New 52 imprint or right before the New 52, where they reimagined him as this sort of effete dandy fop who killed the Lobo we knew right out of the gate, saying he was a clone or an imposter or something. I believe that version of Lobo lasted a little bit over a year, then was quietly put to pasture. Because you can't do Lobo in this day and age. It would be like expecting to go see a sellout Andrew Dice Clay concert. It's just not going to happen. But that doesn't mean, for those of us who are 90s fanboys and look back on the 90s fondly, that doesn't mean that there's not a special place in our heart for the character and for just the absolute chaos that trailed in his wake. Which brings me to the book that fell into my lap this week, the long-awaited co-collaboration, return to form, the long-awaited reunion of Nasser Rabadi and Donal DeLay and Brutus the Badass Volume 2, A Return of Brutus. And I'm not saying Brutus is a copy of Lobo or anything like that, but I am obviously, I don't think there's any secret here, any bones being withheld that Brutus is inspired in a big way by Lobo. There's much in the book that's meant to be an homage to Lobo. And if Brutus were coming out at the same time as Lobo, that would be one thing. But Brutus coming out in a world where there's a Lobo vacuum, where DC Comics, owned by the Discovery Channel, and ESG'd out the wazoo, would never dare or dream of putting out a Lobo comic. There is a place for a Brutus the Badass to elbow everyone else aside and say, I'm here, this is my time, I'm in Comicsgate, try to gatekeep me. So it was, I got the first issue, I actually got the first issue on the secondary market because I'd missed the Brutus Badass 1 the first time around. So about 8 months ago or 9 months ago, I picked up Brutus the Badass on the secondary market. And so I was familiar with the character, and of course, Volume 2 was delivered to my door by elves and fairies and leprechauns this week. And it was a pleasure to see Brutus back. I think both creators have matured and tightened up their work from the last time Brutus was out. I remember consciously thinking in the very beginning of Volume 2 that the art is much tighter than it was in the first book. And the storyline flows much better than in the first book. If I have a complaint, it is there's a big stretch in the middle of the book where the story starts being told non-chronologically. And I get why Nasser did this. It's much like the reason why Christopher Nolan told Memento backwards. There are revelations to be made that have a little bit more impact if you get the scene and then you see the scene that precedes it, so you can see how certain characters might be setting each other up or readying a betrayal or something like that. The only thing that I'll say is, as a reader, it was easy to lose the narrative thread during all that. But then the book finds its way back to present day and and goes in a fairly linear fashion after that. So I could have done without that stretch in the middle, but I'm not saying that I don't understand why it was there or why it was presented like that. And then, as you would expect, it ends with a bang. One other nice thing, and I don't think it was prevalent in the first book, is there was some nice, nifty, I won't say breaking of the fourth wall, but chiseling of the fourth wall, particularly during one humongous battle sequence. And then again at the end, that lent something to the story, again, hearkening back to the old days when Lobo would blatantly mock Alan Grant out of the panel. So, all in all, just a real fun way to spend a Sunday afternoon. Yours truly enjoyed a cinnamon latte with just a hint of sugar-free vanilla because I am low-carbing it these days. That was a nice pairing. When you think Lobo, you think cinnamon vanilla latte, and that's certainly translating to 2023 what you should think of when you think of Brutus the Badass. But other than that, go pick it up, enjoy, and tell them Tuttle sent you.